Hey guys, Tyler Berger here with Bass Fishing HQ, and today I want to talk about something that can be the difference between catching zero fish, getting skunked, and catching some really big bass. So stay tuned, it's going to be a good one. This video is brought to you by the Bass Hat. This hat that I'm wearing right now comes with a unique wooden bass patch on the top of the hat. If you want to help support the channel, click that link in the description and you can pick up a bass hat. I'm out here fishing today and it's a beautiful-ish kind of fall day. The water is pretty cold right now. It actually dropped about 3 or 4 degrees over last night. We had a cold front come in, we had some rain come in. So as you can see, we kind of have some post-frontal conditions. I came out here today kind of expecting to have to slow down and fish something kind of slow and on the bottom to catch bass, right? Because that makes sense. I started out kind of fishing that way and I actually caught a bass doing that. So after I caught that bass on a jig, I continued to fish that jig a lot. I was flipping it, I was pitching it against basically all the wood that I was seeing around. But every time I would look down at my fish finder, I would notice that I would see a bunch of bait fish, but they were really high in the water column. Even if I was in really shallow water, if I was sitting in 6 foot of water, all the bait fish were in that top foot or two of the water. And I kept seeing this and I kept seeing this and I didn't have any more bites. So what I ended up doing is I picked up a spinnerbait and this happened. Let's go. So as you guys can see, I caught a pretty nice bass, especially for the water that I'm fishing today. It isn't a difference between throwing a spinnerbait versus a jig that I want to talk about today. The difference is where that fish was in the water column, because that stump that I caught that bass off was actually in about 4 or 5 foot of water. And that fish was only about a foot below the surface. I was keeping that bait really high in the water column because I had seen all those bait fish really high in the water column. And a few minutes later, I actually sling my spinnerbait up against another log and I hook into an absolute giant. Oh, jeez, that was a biggie. Oh my gosh, that was a giant bass. Oh, you should have seen the boil that just came up. This was like a 4 or 5 pound plus fish, which typically is going to be big bass on the lake that I'm fishing here today. Unfortunately, I lost that fish. The point of me telling you about this is that sometimes as bass anglers, we can actually fish below the bass. And sometimes when you fish below the bass, you actually aren't going to get bites. And even sometimes if you do get bites, they can be really, really small. I actually saw this when I was fishing down on Lake Hartwell down in South Carolina. And down on that lake, you know, the fish feed primarily on blueback herring. A lot of the fish were pretty high in the water column, especially the bigger fish that I was seeing. If you were fishing like a drop shot or a Nico rig or something finessey on the bottom, you would catch fish, but they would be pretty small for the most part. They were 1 pounders. But if you fished up high and fished above where the fish were, you would catch those 2.5, 3.5, 4, 5 pound bass because those fish were really high in the water column.
Where I think most anglers actually miss this is when you're fishing shallow water. I'll never forget when this really first clicked with me was when Kevin Short won a Bassmaster Elite Series on Pickwick Lake back in 2010. He had been fishing in an area full of cypress trees and he was fishing a squarebill crankbait where other anglers around him were flipping and pitching to those same cypress trees. He outperformed all the other anglers in that area because he was fishing at the level or above the level where the bass were at, where many other anglers were missing fish because they were fishing below the bass. Since watching that tournament almost 12 years ago, there have been countless days that I've been fishing shallow water, and if I had been fishing a soft plastic or something on the bottom, I simply would have not been bit. One of the most recent days happened to me just late this last summer. I was fishing in a small creek, and I had started off the day flipping and pitching a jig, and then I got bit while swimming that jig out of a laydown. That clued me in that the bass might be higher in the water column than I had originally thought, and the rest of the day I was able to catch a lot of bass by swimming a jig just below the surface in 5 and 6 foot of water.
Now, I've actually seen this while pond fishing in the exact same way, not just on bigger lakes. I grew up fishing with a 1 acre pond in my backyard, and typically towards the end of summer, what would happen is that you would have these like schools of bluegill in the pond that would suspend really high, and they would just cruise along the surface. They were picking off bugs and just little things that were on the top of the surface. And when they would do this, I would make a change and I would either fish a surface lure or I'd fish a lure like a jerkbait or a rattle trap that would stay kind of suspended in the water column, and I would start catching bass on that opposed to other lures that would sink to the bottom. So the biggest thing that you can really do is always just pay attention to your surroundings. If you're out there and you're noticing that a lot of fish are higher in the water column, you don't want to fish below those fish because sometimes they simply won't bite when you're fishing below them. You got to fish at their level or above them in order to get them to bite. I hope that you guys enjoyed this simple but quick tip. If you did, click on this video because I think you'll enjoy it too. Please subscribe to the channel, comment below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.